speaker, Dr. Beloo Mehra. Dr. Beloo Mehra serves as Director of BhāratShakti, an institute of Sri Aurobindo Society dedicated to research and program development in areas related to Indian culture. A former professor at an American university. For more than 15 years now, she has devoted herself to the field of Sri Aurobindo studies as a student, researcher, writer, educator, program designer, editor, and curator. She writes and speaks regularly on topics related to integral education, Indian culture, social cultural evolution, and integral yoga. She has developed and taught semester-length courses in these areas and has curated several programs for university students in India and the US. Dr. Mehra is the editor of Renaissance, the online journal of Sri Aurobindo Society, and has authored several books including Antaryatra, Soul Journeys, Understanding Contemporary India in the Light of Sri Aurobindo, The Spiritual Foundation of Indian Culture, Indian literary tradition in the light of Sri Aurobindo, and ABCs of Indian national education. Please welcome Beloo.
Thank you, Biswajita. After these beautiful presentations, bringing musical and poetic aspects of, I was going to say Sri Aurobindo, Gurudev Tagore. In some ways they are coming together, wayfarer toward the same goal, kind of a feeling is coming. So, but after these beautiful, expressions that we've seen of Tagore's work from Jishnu and Gayatri, I thought I will take next few minutes to talk a little bit about one aspect of, though most people know of Shantiniketan, not just in India, but also outside India as a great experiment in education. But there is a lot more to his insights on education. In fact, if you go to the website of Vishwa Bharati, at one place, it's mentioned that, they haven't given reference to it, but some great scholar might have said this, that if Tagore had not done anything else, his work as his contribution towards nation building of India and towards the upliftment of civilization for the world, human civilization, would have been just as equally great if only his work as a schoolmaster, not even as an educationist, but just as his work as a schoolmaster would be studied very closely and very deeply. But that is one aspect that other than those who are in fields of education, doing their research in education, most people don't know too much about that, except the fact that there is this place called Vishwa Bharati in Shantiniketan. So I thought I'll just bring up few points in the little time that we have. Tagore's insights on education. And why I've titled it Out of the Golden Cage, I'll just make it clear as I go along. But as Jishnu also shared the same photograph, portrait done by Divine Mother. So there are two ways in which, at least in the little bit time that I've spent researching Tagore's work in the area of education, there are two things that come up very clearly. One, that everything he did in the field of education comes from his personal experience. I could even use the word personal anguish. What he felt, how strongly he felt about the kind of miseducation or bad education that he had a little bit of experience of that. It sort of comes from the anguish of that. He did not want that kind of education for future generations, those who will be building the new India in that time. And that other thing was that he was deeply concerned about the work of cultural and national reawakening. He was one of the great, with all the others who were, this was a time in India, so many great minds were coming up with insights and ideas as to how not only the freedom of India can be secured, but what India will do with the freedom, how we can rejuvenate, renew the cultural spirit that of India, and also the future nation that will be built on those ideas. So those were two things that were kind of driving his work in the field of education. So there is one particular lecture that he gave in US in 1917 where he talked about, and this was titled, his lecture was titled My School. And this was sort of like his memoir on, or his reflection on how, what led him to start Shantiniketan. Shantiniketan, of course, or Vishwa Bharati, Shantiniketan is the name of the place. Vishwa Bharati was officially started in 1921, but before that, there was a school in that same campus, which still exists with a different name, Path Bhavan, I believe. But it was, at that time, it was called Brahmacharya Ashram in 1901. December 22, 1901 was the official date that it opened its doors with only 5 students. And there was another great Bengali intellectual deeply engaged in the work of educational rejuvenation for the country, Brahma Bandhav Upadhyay, who together they were kind of, he had a school in Calcutta at that time. And together they started this Brahmacharya ashram with those 5 students. Later on, the two went separate ways, but the school continued. And in this particular lecture, it's a beautiful reading. Anybody who would like to know what, what was sort of the going on in this great, brilliant mind of Tagore, which led him to do these experiments in education. I've just pulled out 2-3 sentences, 2-3 key insights from there. One is connected with the idea of his personal anguish, his personal pain with the kind of education that was going on at that time, which most of you all know was, of course, the British system of education, the whole Macaulayan ideas and things like that. And this was a time when in India, great debates were going on how to how to make education in the national spirit. By national, not necessarily nation as a state, but the culture, nation as a cultural identity. So as part of that debate, these experiments were going on. So in that essay, or in that lecture rather, Tagore talks about that I was fortunate enough in extricating myself before insensibility set in. So the system of education that was there at that time, and unfortunately, to a very large extent, mainstream education in India still somewhat follows that same kind of education where textbooks and curriculum and methods become priority rather than the child, the learner. He said he was fortunate enough that he didn't have to go through the whole thing. He didn't finish school in that sense. Interestingly, the same insight we find when Sri Aurobindo is describing and analyzing and contextualizing the life and work of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. And going back to what Gayatri said about how Tagore and even Jishnu mentioned how in Bengali households at a certain period of time in Indian history, most of the cultural exposure came from Tagore. Sri Aurobindo makes a mention that rather than school, college textbooks, an average Bengali learns more about life and world, about himself and the world through the works of Bankim Chandra as well as Tagore. So again, and in that context, again, Sri Aurobindo writes that even Bankim did not go through the whole British education, which actually kept his originality alive. So it's very interesting how the two great influencers for Bengali mind at that time. And at that time, Bengal was literally leading the renaissance, the rejuvenation of Indian culture at that time. So whatever Bengal believed or did, the rest of the India followed, as has been said. So both these great influencers, Tagore as well as Bankim Chandra, did not go through the entire painful experience of the British system of education. And in one sentence in that essay, in that talk, Gurudev Tagore emphasizes why the mainstream British system of education was such a big problem. He said because it was set with a certain intention which goes against God's intention, God's plan as to how a child should grow into knowledge. So man's intention or the bureaucrat's intention or the educationist intention goes against what is already planned or willed by God as to how a child will blossom into knowledge. And then at that same time, he was also deeply influenced and he was studying and getting influenced by the work that was coming out, research that was coming out, historical studies that were coming out as to what was the indigenous system of education. And he talked about the Chatushpathi and the toll system, Sanskrit schools in Bengal. And he was deeply impressed by that ideal of education, where within this scheme of the idea of Guru Graha Vas, where a student will stay at the master's house, at the teacher's house, the way gurukuls are organized, sharing a life of high aspiration. So that idea was deeply, it was a great influence on Tagore's mind at that time, which led him to establish this Brahmacharya ashram, where with the idea of learning in a very natural, holistic kind of environment. And again, there is one sentence, one paragraph, which summarizes, it's not even a paragraph, it's just 3 sentences, which summarize his deep insight into what is wrong with the modern mainstream education. I don't want to, in the interest of time, go into great detail as to why this system was introduced. In fact, in England, even at that time, public education system was not of this kind, what they had introduced in India, for a very specific reasons, to make servile, to make Indians servile and to make Indian clerks. So in that talk, Gurudev Tagore talks about we rob the child. How do we rob the child? When we use our intention rather than following God's intention to facilitate the child's blossoming. We rob the child of his earth to teach him geography. We rob the child of language to teach him grammar. His hunger is for the epic, but he's supplied with chronicles of facts and dates. He was born in the human world, but is banished into the world of living gramophones to expiate for the original sin of being born in ignorance. So this is the anguish. This is the dissatisfaction with the current system of education that he was sort of wanting to go against with all his experiments in education. For him, education, the highest purpose that education can have is nothing short of the highest purpose that is there for human life. And what is that purpose? The fullest growth and freedom of soul. Again, Jishnu mentioned about Tagore's meeting with the mother and inviting him to take up the work at Shantiniketan in 1916. This school was already there. Other experiments were going on at the time. But it's so interesting how the similarity in the deepest understandings, deepest insights into what the role of education should be in human life is so much there. Mother has also talked about the soul-based progress. Education should be one that helps full development of the soul, full blossoming of the soul. So it's so, the parallels are very interesting. Now I come to why I thought of this title, Out of Golden Cage. So Tagore was a great poet and a storyteller. And my own reading of Tagore has been few of his essays, few of his writings on education, but a lot more of his short stories and his, plays and novels. And yes, of course, poetry as well. So there is a beautiful story he wrote, I believe in 1918, Tota Kahini, Parrot's Training. And that is something that is sort of like, in one little story, he has explained his entire philosophy of education. So there is a parrot who doesn't know anything, obviously, and parrot has to be taught. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but if you Google, you can find many translations on many websites of this particular story. So a great hall, this parrot has to be educated. And so a great hall of learning is created. A lot of money is spent on creating a golden cage. So goldsmith makes a lot of money. A lot of scholars are invited to figure out what should be the curriculum for this parrot. So scholars make a lot of money. The word that is used in the English translation is pundits. Scribes, people who will write down assignments and tests and all these things, they end up making a lot of money. People who are responsible for keeping the cage clean all the time, scrubs, they are also making a lot of money. And of course, then there is the quintessential inspector, supervisor, who's looking at everything is done. So the whole story goes that in this process, everybody makes money, except what happens to the child, what happens to the learner, what happens to the parent. And when all this is, by the way, done by at the command of at an order of a king, and when the king goes to inspect or to see how what progress is being made, he's so stupefied, or he's so impressed that by the method that has been prescribed by the scholars and the scribes and the supervisors, that he doesn't even ask whether the bird is learning anything or not. So the method was so stupendous, as the story goes, that the bird looked ridiculously unimportant in comparison. Again, a beautiful way to remind us of how in this whole paraphernalia of education, the learner gets missed. The bird looked ridiculously unimportant in comparison. And this is very important because in his lecture that he gives in just before the Vishwa Bharati in 1919 or 1918, which is where one of the key writings of Rabindranath Tagore in the field of education. It's called The Center of Indian Culture, where he describes what his vision for Vishwa Bharati as a university of the world is. He talks about this whole idea about that how so much emphasis is given on paraphernalia of education that the learner gets missed out. So that's what is not, that is what was wrong in the system, and that what still is wrong in the system. And as the story continues, ultimately the bird dies because, other than goldsmith, eventually the iron chain also comes into the picture, because, once in a while bird would still start fluttering its wings wanting to go away, and an iron smith is called and chains are put up, so his wings are eventually cut, and eventually the bird dies, of course. And they do a dissection, and what comes out is an inner stuffing of book leaves. The books, the pages of the books that were fed to him, there is just that. And the learner in the process has died. So in this beautiful, just a 3-4 page story, he has really described what is wrong in the education, and how, his experiment tried to address some of these things. So if we were to look at just few key insights, there are many, but these 4 or 5 words, I think, will really summarize a lot. One is, of course, freedom. He talked about that if education, and we all know the poem which many of us learned by heart in school, where the mind is without fear, into that heaven of freedom, let my country awake. So freedom was very important as a value, as an important approach to learning and the work of learning and teaching. And he talked about not only, that there should be freedom of mind, but freedom of approaches, as Jishnu's... Sorry? As Jishnu was also talking about the example, giving the free expression to Nandalal Bose and Ram Kinkar, completely different styles, and yet each has to be expressed in their own way. So freedom of mind is only possible, he talked about, when there is freedom in the environment, in the learning environment that is given. Nature, again, not just the external nature with trees and all. Of course, in fact, when you look at his, the essay that I was talking about, My School, the talk, his lecture in 1917 about My School, he talked about how trees are so important in the
Excuse
school.
me, Beludi, please try to complete.
Okay, I'll finish this in next 2-3
Okay.
minutes. But also the idea of natural, how do we grow, how do we learn in a very natural way? Only when there is also an environment of creative activity that is going on. And as an educator, I find this very important, because in an environment where teachers themselves are not engaged in creative work, it could even be how to teach differently, how to teach using new approaches, or using creative approaches. That itself is an important way to engage in educational creative activity. That was also very important in Tagore's vision of education. Beauty, of course, the role of arts, music, development of aesthetic sensibility, harmony with nature, harmony with entire life, harmony within and without, and ultimately the idea of unity of truth at all levels of the being, from physical to spiritual. He talked about that, as Jishnu also mentioned, his view of spiritual quest was not to seek renunciation outside of this world, but in this life. Again, following the line of the Vedic Vedantic rishis of life-affirming spirituality. So the quest for truth has to be at all levels of existence, from physical to spiritual, because even in the physical world, it's the spirit that is expressed in matter. That's why the emphasis on beauty, emphasis on harmony with life, with the world. The other thing that, again, which is not often talked about, is the idea of, today we talk so much about decolonizing education, but Tagore was one of the first ones within, again, that, as I said, it was a time when so many people, certainly from Bengal, Satish Chandra Mukherjee, Brahmabandha Upadhyay, several others were going on. Even before that, Swami Dayanand, and then of course Sri Aurobindo comes to Bengal, the founding of National College of Bengal, National Council of Education, Ashutosh Mukherjee. So much work was going on in the realm of nationalizing or bringing the national spirit in education. And in this lecture that he gave in Madras just 2 years before the official Vishwabharati launch, was to, what this center of Indian culture would be like. On each race, he talked about, there is a duty that is given to keep alight its own lamp of mind as its part in the illumination of the world. To break the lamp of any people is to deprive it of its rightful place in the world festival. So essentially the same idea that we find in Sri Aurobindo's writings on education also, that each culture, each civilization has something unique to give to the world. And if we take away that, the whole world will feel the loss. So to break the lamp of any people is to deprive it of its rightful place in the world festival. There are two other quick writings that I will mention, which are not often discussed. One of his earliest speeches, actually, in 1892 or 1893, different researchers place it at different times, where he emphasized so much about the use of mother tongue, especially at the primary and the elementary level. But again, it connects with the cultural rejuvenation of Bengal also, what the work he did in the revival of Bengali language and literature. Why? Because mother tongue is the only language through which one can facilitate thought and express the cultural ethos. And then there is another beautiful writing of Tagore from 1903, where he really tackles the problem of how history should be written. And I'm not going to read the whole quote, but he talked about that why Indian end up imitating. At that time, it was very true, probably to a very large extent, it's still true. Why we end up imitating? Because we don't know what our ancestors have done. If we don't know, what are we aiming at? to which direction are we going to? The way we get our education since our childhood, with every passing day, we get increasingly alienated from our own country till a sense of rebellion against the land of our birth overtakes our mind. So he talked about that it's so important to know our history from our own perspective. And this is a beautiful essay if somebody would like to read. And finally, I come to Vishwa Bharati, where again, the idea, see, he talked about the national and cultural reawakening, but why? Because it was also to be done for the future of the world civilization, advancement of the human civilization, collective civilization. And if you look at the mission and vision statement of Vishwabharati, you get this idea that it's a place where all cultures of India and Asia are coming together to engage with cultures of the rest of the world. So the motto that he gave to this institution was Yatra Vishwam Bhavite Needam, where the whole world will meet in a single nest, in a single resting place. So what I would just like to end, since we are celebrating the legacy, so I don't want to bring up other things, but there is one letter which he actually placed in the hand of Mahatma Gandhi in 1940, as if passing on the legacy of Vishwa Bharati to Gandhi to take care for the future of India. And he said, Vishwa Bharati is like a vessel which is carrying the cargo of my life's best treasure. And I hope it may claim special care from my countrymen for its preservation. And if you Google Vishwa Bharati today, and if you are familiar with some of the discourses that are happening around this institution, in 1951, it becomes a central university. And after that, many other things start. And one of the things that even started at the time of Tagore himself, he did not want examinations, for example. But in 1930s, because it was affiliated to Calcutta University, it had to start a system of examination. So again, Tagore made a comment about how he was pained by that, and yet that was the system at that time. So it has had to make many compromises, probably with the application of the ideal, and there are many other things that are going on, but that is a work left to us, because that's what he said, it's my life's best treasure. And as Indians, we should take care of, this Vishwa Bharati deserves that special care for its preservation of the ideal, and what should I say, living of the ideal, which is not necessarily happening. So I wouldn't go into details of that, but I'll leave it here. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Beloo.